All right, so chapter 3, it's talking about population geography. Population geography, sometimes called geodemography. Geodemography. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things in this chapter. Only the first couple things today that will fit in. Population. Where is it? How much people are there? Why are there these flows of it? Population increasing, population decreasing. What part of that is natural, just people having more kids? What part of that is people moving around? We'll hopefully answer a bunch of these questions. See what they put? There's literally like 3 devices up here for forwarding slides, but none of them work. Population geography. Well, Earth's population is rising. They used 2017 to talk about it being 7.5 billion people because that's kind of a bit of a nice even number. I was looking up today; it's about 7.8, I think. So we're approaching 8 billion. As I'm sure some of you might not be surprised that population growth the past couple of years has slowed down a little bit. For a few different reasons, right? Well, people have guesses why population growth has slowed down the past couple of years? Yeah.
More people move to cities, they don't need kids to work on the farm.
That's true, but that isn't the main factor over the past couple of years. In fact, a lot of people in cities have moved back to their rural areas. It's been a real crazy kind of reverse, right? Just the past couple of years. Any big events? Yeah. Yeah, the death rate has really gone up, right? Death rate has really gone up. Also, I was looking at the statistics for Minnesota, as well as the U.S., the nation. The birth rates, how many people want to have kids? A lot of people are just like, too much stress, too much going on. I'm going to put off having kids for a little while, right? So we live in a pretty unique chapter of history as far as that stuff goes. The book, whenever they talk about population, they always put in pictures from India. Anyone here been to India? It is a pretty densely populated place. And I would say, well, as you can see, a lot of people there are on foot, right? And, that road there, you can see vehicles on it. It's quite congested. There's quite a few roads when I was in India that would be like that. It would be a similar situation to when I was in Cairo, actually. And Egypt has far less of a population cluster. So just looking at one of the maps from this chapter, you can see North and South America isn't on this. They're on another one that we'll be looking at. But these are some of the main population clusters. East Asian cluster, Indian subcontinent. Now this includes Bangladesh and Pakistan, but not this side of Pakistan. European cluster, it's one of those interesting things where if there had not been basically a valve of population moving out of Europe to the Americas for hundreds of years, this would actually look a lot more like these areas being kind of the centers of civilizations and large empires historically. Let's see if I forget anything else. All right, population. When we're looking at population, usually talking about people per square mile. We'll also talk about carrying capacity quite a bit, although what that means and how much that is argumentative. As it says there, maximum number of people who can be supported in a given area is the carrying capacity. People usually kind of picture like a rocket ship type of a thing. Like, well, how much stuff does it take in that rocket ship to sustain those people on there? Is there enough of that stuff, or is it going to run out and then the people would perish, right? So here's that larger map. I would say probably in the next decade or two, probably parts of Africa will look a bit more like this. I don't know if the Americas will actually get a lot more population density than they have. You can see we're quite a bit more spread out. So carrying capacity, well, talked about that a little bit already. I would say we're going to look at a couple different measures to try to figure out what that means. I'm not going to answer that question for right now. World's most populous countries, right? You know, it's interesting because when they say largest countries, kind of picture size. What you see in 2010 and then predicted in 2050. 2010 not being too far away in our past. You see the United States is kind of up there as far as populations. We're quite a large place. If you can picture a place like Bangladesh. Bangladesh is something like, I believe, half the size of Minnesota. I'm trying to remember, maybe a little bit larger than half the size of Minnesota. People know what the population of Minnesota is about? I think it's 5, might be getting close to 6, but I think it's 5.5 million. Well, if you can imagine 156 million people in our state, right? If you could picture that, it might be difficult to picture that. If the whole state was as densely populated as downtown Minneapolis, right? But now, of course, a lot of these places, Bangladesh especially, it doesn't have infrastructure like downtown Minneapolis. There are places in the world that are very populated that have buildings and resources and stuff, like if you ever go to Hong Kong or something, very densely populated. Well, that's the kind of thing when we're talking about carrying capacity, what's realistic, what's not. You know, though people would argue that although we have less population density, we use a lot of the Earth's resources, right? Here in the US, resources that, well, obviously if we're buying them from other countries, those countries don't have that to use. That's actually one of the things going on with Iran. Iran has a good amount of oil, but they subsidize the price of oil to be very inexpensive for their own populations. And through time, their own populations, as they've developed and people bought cars and whatnot, they're using more and more oil, but they do need that money for foreign currency exchange. And so that's one of the reasons why they've been pushing so hard for alternative fuel sources such as nuclear power. You've probably seen that on the news every now and then, especially, well, before the pandemic, this was kind of a bigger news story because people were like, oh, Iran shouldn't be allowed to have any kind of nuclear technology, and other people said, oh, they should do what they want, they're their own country. Well, it's mostly a financial problem, because they're getting to the point where they're consuming almost all the oil that they produce themselves, you know, because like we produce oil too, we just use it all. We are one of the kind of major oil producing countries of the world, but we need more, right? We're shipping in more. Now, hypothetically, if the U.S. said something like, okay, Iran, let's make some deal, you could use that as a power source. Other countries do. France and Germany, majority of their power is nuclear, although Germany is switching to solar and wind. But you know, like I said, if we said, okay, Iran, you go ahead. Well, technically that would decrease the price of oil for us because the supply of oil for the world would greatly increase if they weren't using it, because they're using it for just electricity and things like that as well, not just cars. Couple different statistics that we're going to be talking about. Birth rates, number of births per year per 1,000 people, total fertility rate, average number of children born per woman during her lifetime. Obviously these numbers are are going to give us an indication of how much population has natural increase, right? This isn't taking into account migration or anything, just how many people are having how many kids. Total fertility rate of 2.1 is needed for a stable population. All right, so when it comes to crude birth rates, like when I was saying that you could see this area is going to be more of a population in the future, you could kind of see that direction. One indication of crude birth rates, right? Total fertility rate by region. As you can see, a lot of these numbers are not that high, even though when we were looking, it was kind of making it seem that there's a great difference in how many children people in Asia have versus, say, the United States or Europe, but it's not that different. But in Africa, there's quite a bit, right? But it's not just about births, right? It's mortality, death rates. Let's see. Oh, and also infant mortality rates, which is number of live births per 1,000 who died before reaching 1 year of age. Year of age. There's arguments that have been made that that indication should be 2 years of age because that's more of the window that there's a high infant mortality rate in some places, but we haven't really switched over to using that. All right. World pattern of infant mortality rate, right? So similar to the birth rate, right? So when we saw the birth rates, the first thing that came to mind is these are places that are rapidly growing. Well, if we see the infant mortality rate, well then we suddenly realize, oh, that's the other side of the coin, right? It's like, well, if children aren't surviving being an infant, that doesn't give you a lot of demographic momentum. Demographic transition. Actually, let me get to a little image. The demographic transition model. I think it's a very interesting model because I've seen it through time, and I'm old enough to remember in the 70s, 80s, there was a big movement called the zero population growth movement. I knew of a guy who had a car and he had a great big ZPG on his car, and he was just like an advocate, and that we should be having less kids because then we'll have more resources. Well, let me summarize this. Historically, and this was first noted in England, and so that's one of the reasons why they somewhat call this a Eurocentric model. It's because that's where these stages were first kind of identified. But as in a nutshell, historically, if you think of hunter-gatherer societies, as in Guns, Germs, and Steel, when all societies were relatively equal to each other, there was a very high birth rate, but also a high death rate. So populations were relatively stable, although slowly increasing. And you'd have ups and downs, obviously. There would be great plagues that had high death rates, but you also had some places that would have times of plenty. Well, as places develop, you could think of this broadly as, as places develop, you invent agriculture, right? You invent and figure out health things, right? How to make it so that children live longer. You have better nutrients, a number of different things happen. And so what happened in Britain was the death rate started to go down. Including the child mortality rate would go down. Now, during the period of time that the death rate is going down, but the birth rate stays high, that's when you get your big growth of population. Through time, what happens is people have less kids. And eventually, there is another kind of stable point, right? Now, when I say that happened in Britain, it's interesting because it's also happened in other places in Europe. But there was a time when there was an argument that the demographic transition model is a cultural thing, and that, well, it made sense for it to happen in Britain, but people argued places like Ireland or Spain and Italy, they have different cultures, and they're just always going to have large families. Nothing will ever change that. That's just how their culture is. Well, no, they were just a step behind. So when people were saying that, they were in this phase with high birth rate, but their death rate were going down. Those are places that also stabilize their birth rate. I still remember arguments being made about Latin America. Again, it would be like, oh, they're just different. They have large families and Roman Catholic and all this, and they'll never have less kids. But they also did, and sure enough, that in large parts of Asia that have large populations, they also eventually went through these phases. So to me, it's still called a Eurocentric model, but to me it's more of a kind of common development model that happens in most places. And there's no real reason to assume it won't happen in other places that are just now in this phase, right? If they're in these phases. Usually what happens when I read about these changes worldwide, well, it's similar to what happened in the United States, where you would have relatives of mine who came in from Ireland. They'd have a big family and 8 kids, but when they moved here, well, they were much more prosperous than they were in Ireland. So what they're used to is, maybe most of the births that you have, they would die before they reached adulthood, and they wouldn't have children themselves. It's part of the reason people would have lots of kids. Now, those 8 kids, when they grew up, very often they kind of shook their heads, and they're like, boy, that was a lot of kids for one household. We did not have the resources we could. What I'm going to do, I'm going to have 4 kids, because I don't want to be like my brothers and sisters were. That person has kids. And again, all the children live and grow to adulthood. When those children grow up, very often they'll have a similar thing. Well, they'll say, 4 kids, it was just too many of us, and I'm not going to do that. When I have kids, I'm going to have less. That seems to be what happens as long as that death rate goes down. As long as that death rate goes down. All right. Our text talks about suggesting that countries have skipped stages. I'm not sure if China technically skipped its stage, because the death rate was going down quite a bit. And would the birth rate have come down if it had not been for the one-child policy? It's like, well, it seemed to in lots of other places. India doesn't have a one-child policy, but their average number of children has been decreasing through time. So, like I said, it's one of those things that it's like, well, I guess we'll never know. Then obviously, places can move backward on the model. Yes. These are a good indication of how developed or wealthy a place is, but it's not 100% surefire way to determine that. All right, fertility rate, right? If you remember, 2.1 is replacement level. So you can see a lot of stuff going on here. So you remember when I said this region was having less kids? You could see that there are a lot of places. This map was quite different just a couple decades ago. There are places that have negative growth. They're not really shown on a map like this. Russia has had a real tough time ever since the Soviet Union fell. The death rate has gone up especially for men. So places are going through lots of different things. But you can see fertility rate, still got a lot of population growth in Central Africa. Right? Crude death rate, again, showing similar to the other maps that we looked at. Well, I was just talking about this area. Right? So it's like, well, how much actual growth is there if there's so much death as well as births? So age distributions and population pyramids. You might have used a population pyramid in a previous class. It's a pyramid because traditionally, well, actually, I got examples of population pyramids. Oh man, hold on one sec. These are viewable from where you guys are. All right, so population pyramids. The reason they're called pyramids, some of these are copies from each other, is because the traditional structure is like a pyramid, where you have more younger people, right, and less older people. But there's all kinds of things that go on when it comes to populations that kind of shift these things. So United States population, why is this area bigger?
The baby boomers.
Baby boom generation, yeah. I'm sure people know the term boomer. People know why there was a population boom in the United States at that point in time? That made that generation? Why did everyone have a bunch of kids? Yeah. Yeah, World War II, which was a long and bloody conflict, and before World War II we had the Great Depression. So we had a couple decades really, and the only reason this top one here looks like it's extra big is because they have 80 plus, and so it's just a lot more people. To me, it's like, well, don't have that as a category then, because that's a number that looks different. But so as I was saying, the baby boomers at the end of the Second World War, so it was a worldwide conflict, right? And it was in the news, and it was kind of the driving force behind everyone's life for many years. And so when it seemed that there was going to finally be peace and prosperity, soldiers demobilized and came back home. And then there was relative economic prosperity, especially in the United States. Other countries in Europe, it took them longer to have their populations come back. They didn't have quite the boom because they had to rebuild first because so much had been destroyed. The United States had not been destroyed. Not only that, but our factories were going, and worldwide, we were one of the only places that our factories weren't blown up. So we were doing great. Let's see, what else can I point out here? Population pyramids. Well, Sun City, Arizona, as you can see, it's a retirement community, right? Retirement community. So they're not really too worried about sustainability, right? They're not worried about getting young people in there. Let's see, anything else to note about these? One of the reasons why an older term for the millennial generation was Echo Boomer, because it was a bit larger of a generation just because they were the children of this generation. And because there was more people there, Gen X was just the smaller generation in between us. And it's interesting because, a thing in the news lately is what is often termed the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation. Have people heard of that term in news? Maybe, sort of. Well, demographically, a lot of people are quitting their jobs. And a lot of different news publications kind of talk about this in lots of different ways. But when you look at the underlying factors of what's going on, a lot of that is generational changeover. Because you have a very large baby boom generation who are all near retirement age. And a lot of them during the pandemic, many jobs became very difficult, right? You know, I don't know if you guys are working, but even school during the pandemic, all of a sudden you had all these layers of different stuff you had to worry about. You have all this kind of stress just from your daily life. And so a lot of baby boomers, if they had the option available, they just took early retirement. They just took early retirement. So you have a whole upper echelon of all kinds of jobs that are vacating. Well, people in the next generation down, Gen X, that's been a whole bunch of jobs above them that they're qualified for. So they've quit lots of their jobs and moved up. And there's been an effect of each generation. So the millennials, right, all these Gen X jobs have opened up. And so they've moved up there. And so we have a big changeover happening. And changeovers like this happened kind of all the time, but in big leaps like they have in the past couple of years, in some far future date when the pandemic is behind us, and they'll be looking at demographics and stuff, they might be talking about this being a very large cultural turning point, because the older generation has a lot of different kind of values and norms than the younger generation. And that tends to be true everywhere, but in the United States especially, if you look at political surveys and stuff. So we might be seeing a real big changeover. All right, let me go back a little bit. All right. Oh yes, mortality rate. All right, and then putting these things together, annual population change. So even with high death rate, there's still a good amount of population growth happening in lots of places of the world. This chapter will talk a fair amount about gender for a number of different reasons. Partially because, well, obviously, when we talk about births, right, we're talking about average births per woman usually. And there's also the way that people are treated when they're young, depending on gender, can change the odds that they will survive to be an adult, right? Because in different countries around the world, people of different genders are treated quite a bit differently, right? They're given different gender roles. Actually, I'm gonna skip this stuff. Youth and old age populations. So this is another thing that's kind of making a lot of headlines these days is, well, a lot of countries, they have a larger, older population, right? And it's like, well, what's the problem with that conceptually? Well, one of the main problems is people are worried about who's going to take care of them when they get into old age, right? There's plenty of people who don't have kids. I will say, even though in Europe there's a real good social safety net, things like Social Security that we have that older people can use to sustain themselves, but the actual just kind of manpower, the people who will be working in, say, nursing homes as an example, there's a bit of a worry about that. In, well, some areas of Europe, there's been more immigration to help with that, of younger populations from other countries, but it really depends. So for example, quite a few kind of northern countries will have a bit more open policy when it comes to immigration, but quite a few that are kind of lower income and have higher unemployment rates are less welcoming of immigration. Japan, for instance, does not have a lot of immigration, and they've actually tried to reach out to Japanese populations who've moved away from Japan and who live in other countries. So like Peru, for example, has a substantial Japanese population. Hawaii has a substantial Japanese population. And they've reached out saying, hey, come back to your home country and we need your youth and vitality. And that's been not successful, because very often populations, if they've moved to a place and they've lived there for generations, they usually have just fully assimilated into their new place, right? And they don't want to necessarily leave everything that they know. Gender ratio. So let's see. When we look at these, usually gender ratio, what that is talking about is, well, there is sex selective births happening more in some countries and less in other countries. What I mean by that is culturally, a number of different countries, and we'll get more into this next time, a number of different countries, well, they prioritize male births, and they'll get an ultrasound or they'll get some way to check what gender their child is going to be, and very often they will have an abortion if it is going to be a girl and not if it's going to be a boy, right? The kind of normal ratio tends to be pretty even, right? Not exactly 50-50, but pretty even. All right. Well, we've been talking a bit about mobility and how this affects populations. And it obviously affects populations because it's people who are leaving some places and going to other places, right? I've got a map here of a lot of different major and minor immigration streams. I would say most of these immigration streams, very often people are moving to places where there's better employment, right? And away from places, sometimes it's bad employment, sometimes it could be a local war, local famine, all kinds of different things, right? Humans have always been a very kind of mobile species. We walk as kind of our natural thing to do. It kind of is a big part of what being a human is. It's part of the reason why humans spread around the earth before we had real technology even, right? We had hardly any technology and we were almost in every corner of the world. Even pushing out other pre-human species that we were at the same place at the same time with, like say Neanderthals, right? Who were mostly in Eurasia, as we would say. So in geography, we have a lot of what we call push factors and pull factors. And students will often get these really mixed up on quizzes and stuff. Well, they're not that difficult of concepts. So, push factor, unfavorable, repelling conditions that spur migration, right? This could be all kinds of things. I would say the majority push factors are usually incomes are decreasing or are low where a person is, right? Pull factors, favorable, attractive conditions that spur migration. Now there's lots of different push factors, lots of different pull factors. Like for example, think of your ideal climate you'd want to live in, like the perfect climate if you could pick everything about it. Does it match up with Minnesota? For anybody? Yeah. All right. So people who like winter sports. Well, I would say when I was looking at statistics this morning, well, Minnesota has had quite a few people move out the past couple of years. Quite a few people move out. And when you look at mostly where people have moved to from Minnesota, the Sun Belt. They're moving to sunny places, they're moving to places with better weather, which isn't a difficult thing to find. You could probably throw a dart at a map and find a place that has a bit of a better weather in general. Lots of my friends, if they have moved to Texas, Colorado, California, right? They want more sun. Though my friends in Colorado are finding that they are getting more snow, so that's on them. Well, anyways, I was saying push factors and pull factors. So a push factor would be someone just being, I don't know, they're digging their car out of the snow and they say, that's it, I'm fed up. This cold has pushed me out of the state, I'm leaving, right? Now that doesn't determine where you're gonna go. Pull factors there's lots of warm states, right? And so the people that I know that moved, they also moved to places that they had friends, that they could find jobs, things like that, right? Because, you know, if you want to go sunny, well, actually, a lot of people are moving to Arizona, a pretty sunny place, a bit less to New Mexico. All right, push factors and pull factors. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of movement of people that push-pull factors aren't really in play, forced migration. And there's been all kinds of this from slavery to people who have been forcefully removed from countries. Very often this will be a population that might be an ethnic minority in a country, and you have had the majority population basically have a decree that they're the only population that should be living there, and the population could be outlawed or find themselves outlawed and have to move elsewhere if they can. Refugees also, and there's all kinds of refugees. On the news, you'll see lots of conflict and famine. Increasingly, people are worried about climate change refugees. There's a lot of small-scale climate changes that have happened that have kind of nudged people out of different ways. I mean, very specifically, like, oh, no, I forget the name. There's this tropical island that is just, it was already barely above sea level, but it is now under sea level, and they just literally had to leave, right? They didn't have a choice. The whole population of the island had to move. I'll look up the name for the next class. Major and minor migration flows today. All right, so countries that are getting migration in, and places that people are leaving. All right. Now, if you look at the map, you know, it's not the weather concerns in the example that I was using. I would say in general, it's, well, push-pull factors. I would say the pull factors of the places that people are picking are stability and jobs. Often personal freedoms is also a part of that equation, but definitely good employment. The push factors from places, there's lots of different things. There's definitely places on this map that people have left due to armed conflicts, especially in the Horn of Africa, as this area is always called, the Horn of Africa. Lots of conflicts there, and we have people locally in Minnesota who have come because of these conflicts. Plenty of other places, not specific conflicts, but they're moving. It's probably more the pull factor than the push factor. They're moving because they want higher incomes. Diseases. Yeah, this will be a good thing to wrap up on. Diseases. You know, it's interesting because, well, obviously people, historically, when there's been great plagues and whatnot, people will attempt to leave those areas and move away. And so that's an actual thing, especially historically, that has led to movements of populations. In general, today, in our pandemic, well, people are bringing the diseases with them to wherever they go. So people, largely, they're not getting away from the pandemic. Sometimes people are moving to places that have more healthcare options. Sometimes people are moving to places that are more open, right? It kind of depends. It's kind of a wide range. But when it comes to the geography of disease, kind of one of the first times that geography really came out to solve a health riddle, right, was in London. Well, a lot of people had cholera. A lot of people had cholera, and there wasn't a lot known about cholera at the time. That's the thing if you ever read about the pandemic of 1918. A lot of people are kind of reading up on it because it's not dissimilar to what we're going through. But if you read up on it, people largely did not have any idea what it was and what to do about it. They had some amount of masking and things that seemed to work sometimes, but they didn't really have a fundamental knowledge of what that was as a disease. Well, this is a different time frame, but similarly, a lot of people just thought it was bad air and weren't sure what that meant. Very often that's why people would move from an area because there'd be disease, and they would just kind of determine, some bad air in that area, so let's just move. Well, geographer looked at a map, mapped a bunch of specific cholera cases, found out that they were all in range of one main water source. Right? This water source had become contaminated. Now we know full on that's what cholera happens. That's how it happens. But he was able to, they cleaned up that well, and they solved that cluster of that disease. And that's typically what happens with this disease. Still today, there's outbreaks of cholera, but we at least know where it comes from and how to stop it. All right, y'all. Talk your ears off. I'll let you go with that one. We'll come back to all this next week. Thanks for coming.